Miss Osuna here with part 2 of our shirt jack. So now what we need to do is bring our notches together. So you have a yoke, which is the upper portion of your back, and then you have the lower back. Bring your notches together so that you can create your pleats and they face the center. So the notch is in the center. And so that at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, we are just going to stay stitch that in place temporarily. We won't take it out later. So back stitch at the beginning and end. It's just in the 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. We're going to repeat that process for the other pleat. So you're just going to bring the outer notch towards the inner so that the pleat depth is facing the center. So the outer one goes to the inner one so that it can face the center. Stitch that down at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance so that our pleat is in place, and then we'll have the correct width to sew on our yoke. As always, once you finish sewing, you want to press. Remember that pressing helps you to melt the fibers of your fabric with the fibers of your thread. And then we are going to move on and sew the yoke, which is that upper portion. You have 2 yokes on our shirt jack. So we're starting with 1 yoke. We're going to sew that to the actual lower back. So these will be sewn at 1/2 of an inch seam allowance following your notches. Make sure, of course, that you backstitch at the beginning and the end. Now, in my case, I have 2 different fabrics. The fabric that is thicker is the green one, so I am using the green one on top. And then my thinner, slightly thinner fabric is the black, so that's why that one is on the bottom. That will help to alleviate any problem with puckers and sewing in any types of gathers. We want it to be perfectly flat, so I'm using the thicker fabric on top in my case, and my thinner one is underneath. But they are face to face. Once we finish sewing, we actually are pressing this seam allowance upward, which is counterintuitive, but remember we have our second yoke that'll be covering it. So the seam allowance in this case is going to be pressed upward. So now that we have our back together, we have the yoke as well as our lower back completely sewn together at our 1/2 inch seam allowance, it's time for us to sew the front to the back at the shoulder. So make sure everything is face to face, and we are following our notches at 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, now it's time to repeat for the other shoulder. Again, it's 1/2 of an inch seam allowance and they're being sewn together face to face. Now that we've connected the front to the back at the shoulder, it's time for us to fold our facing. So our front shirt jack has a facing that is built in. That's this extra extension part. So that folds back. You have a notch at the very center and then a notch to the left and to the right of center. So fold back your facing that is built in on your shirt jack. So fold that back so it lines up. There's 3 notches once again. One is in the center and then one on the right and left. Fold that back and line that up nicely along your shoulder. That is how we start so that we can align our shirt jack so we can get ready to sew the second yoke. As always, every time we sew, head back to the iron. So your shoulders, now that they are sewn in place, should be pressed going downward. So that shoulder goes downward and our yoke seam goes upward. So they face each other because they're going to be completely covered by our second yoke. Just as a heads up, we're going to fold back this facing that is built in. Just want to hold it there and show you that's how it's ultimately going to look. First, we've got to put in our collar, but that is ultimately how it will look. That facing is going to fold back and our yoke is going to cover all of our seams. So let's get this collar pinned and sewn down, and then we will flip that facing back and sew it to our yoke. So line up your top collar and bottom collar. You've already connected it together. Line that up completely with the bottom collar facing down. That's the one with the understitching. The top collar is facing up. Use your notches starting at the center and you want to pin. So pinning from your center heading over towards the side. Make sure that our raw edges are lined up. Okay, so you're going to notice that the pinning lines up at our notch for the shoulder, and then there's a notch where the end of our collar is, and then there's notches at the center back. So check all of your notches, make sure they line up, pin very well, and then once again, of course, you know you cannot sew on top of pins with our industrial equipment, so take them out as you go. All right, let's go on ahead and sew our collar in at 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Of course, you are remembering to take out those pins before you roll over them because we never roll over our pins with our industrial equipment. Once again, for this class, I highly recommend that you start at the center so that nothing slides, and then head over towards the right side. And then repeat that process, start at the center and head over towards the left side. In the industry, of course, the sewing machine operators would sew from left to right completely, but we don't want anything to shift or move. Everything needs to land exactly in the right spot. So a very safe way to do that is to start sewing in the center and then repeat that process after you finish one side and head over to the other side. All right, so this is the second part of me sewing the actual collar to our shirt jack, because again, I did it from the center and then I moved over because I don't want any sliding or shifting to happen at all on you. I want you to be able to just get in there, pin it, and then sew, taking out the pins before you roll over them. But sometimes if you start from the far right, even though it's pinned, things will still move because you are removing the pins before we sew. So this is just my hack and a way to avoid that problem. Start in the center of your collar, head over to the right, and then go to the other side. All right, so we have our collar sewn in place. We know that we have the top collar with no understitching, and our bottom collar is the side with the understitching. So when you fold that collar down, your top collar will be what we see, and the top collar is larger. Okay, so now that that collar is nice and in place, press like crazy, and then we're gonna move on. So fold your actual front facings so that they line up with your neckline, and we have the wrong sides facing us. And line up that fold right at the center notch. There's 3 notches. So line that up and you'll see it falls right in place with your shoulder seam. And that is how we set ourselves up to get ready to sew our facings. That's the folded back part. We're sewing that facing to our second yoke. Once again, be sure those 3 notches are correct. One is in the center for the center front, at the neckline and at the hem, and then there's a notch to the left and to the right of that. And if you fold it exactly there, it'll line up perfectly, laying at your shoulder. Now turn it over and grab your second yoke with that folded facing in place. And then we are going to match the facing to the yoke right at our necklines. So they are going to be sewn together face to face, a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, so now that you have folded that in place, you see where we are sewing. Go on ahead and flip it, put it under your machine, backstitch at the beginning and end. Once again, it's a 1/2 inch seam allowance. All right, so now that we've sewn it, you can see when you lay it down how it's gonna look. So we're just gonna lay down our shirt jack right on the table so you can see your work with the right sides facing up, and then fold back that facing and you'll see you've now connected one side of your yoke so that it'll be face to face. Okay, up next, we're getting ready to do the other side. So once again, we have everything with the right sides up. Line up your other side so that your facing folds right back and lines up along your neckline. You'll see your notches. Flip it over and line up your yoke, the second one, and we are attaching it to the facing in the same manner. This is a 1/2 inch seam allowance, of course, backstitch at the beginning and end. All right, so we've lined up our facings and sewn both sides of our facings to our second yoke. Let's move on. Next, we're going to sandwich in our collar. We've sewn it, but now we're going to sandwich it between those yokes and the facings. So in order for us to sandwich in our collar, we are simply going to flip it down. All right, so you can see where we are here. We've sewn the shoulders for our yoke and our facing together. Our collar is already in place. Now we are gonna flip the collar down and sew right across that neckline. This is gonna be a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Again, I typically like to see this class starting in the center, which is our back, and those seam allowances for those shoulders go upward toward the center back. But I like to see you start your sewing, lining up your notches at the center back, and then go down one side and then do the other. Because if you start from the far left and go to the right, lots of times things will shift, and we don't want that. We've done one side of our neckline. We've sandwiched in that collar. And up next, it's going to be time to do the other side. So this is a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and end. That shoulder seam where we connected our yoke and our facing goes upward or towards the center back. And make sure that you keep everything in alignment. Going through all of the layers because we are sandwiching in that collar. The yoke at our neckline will cover up our collar seams. Now we clip. Make sure that your clipping is not going through your stitches, but because the collar neckline is very round, you want to make sure you have lots of clips, but don't go through the stitches. Go close to it, but not through it. All right, now go press because of course you want to press every time that you're doing your sewing. And then our next thing is going to be to flip everything right side out. Make sure that you get those corners of your center front neckline completely turned out. So I have lots of clips there. Put your thumb in, match your index finger, and push out those corners and press as you flip things right side out. Just check to make sure that your work is accurate. If you missed any spots, you got to go back in and get those. So now that we have sandwiched in our collar beautifully, it's time to deal with the shoulder seams for the yoke. And our second yoke is going to cover up that shoulder seam at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So start at the edge where your armhole is and go as close as you can toward the neckline. Sewing on the same sewing line that you already did for the first yoke. And it is a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once again, you will need to clip as you get closer to that shoulder, and you won't be able to go all the way up to the neckline, but get as close as you can, starting from the armhole edge. 1/2 inch seam allowance, sewing on the same exact sewing line. Make sure you trim all of your thread once you finish and flip it right side out. Take a look at your work. Always double check to see if we didn't miss anything. Remember, you can't get all the way up, but just get as close as you can and then move on to the next side. So here I am sewing the second side. So we're just repeating that first process. It's a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And make sure you backstitch at the beginning and end. Get up as close as you can, but don't worry, you can't get all the way up, but maybe within an inch. All right, so now we've sewn both the left and the right sides of our second yoke. And now it's going to be time to sew the lower portion of our yoke. And this technique is going to be called the burrito. So let's move on. We've already done that neckline. The shoulders are in place. Let's deal with our lower portion of the yoke, and that portion is called the burrito. It's going to cover up our seam. So we're just simply going to roll our shirt jack so that we can expose that seam, and it'll be a clean finish. Okay, let's do the rolling of our shirt jack so that we can do our clean finish at the bottom edge of the yoke. So first things first, you can see here we are on the inside of our garment. Everything is laid out. Shoulders are beautifully in place and covered. And now we need to get access to our lower portion of our seam. So turn everything over so that the front is facing up, just like this. And now from the very bottom of your garment, roll it as tightly as you can. Try and squeeze that in there as small and tight as you can. And now you see that seam is exposed. Then we're going to roll that collar down and flip the yoke so that it comes around to connect with our lower seam. And we're going to sew just like that. So this is our burrito technique on that same sewing line at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And once we're done sewing, we will flip this right side out. All right, so we're going to start that sewing on the same sewing line at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and end. Make sure that you rolled your burrito nice and tightly so that you're not sewing on top of it. And again, when you're finished, we're going to flip that right side out. Okay, so now we are done with that sewing. We did our burrito. Now it's going to be time for us to flip this garment right side out. So you're just going to pull it through and turn it right side out. And then, of course, press like crazy because you've been folding it and rolling it and it got really wrinkled. So go back in and make sure after you pull it all out gently that you press. Okay, so that is our burrito technique. Once again, go back and press. Look at all those wrinkles. That's terrible. Oh my goodness, I can't take it. Press it now. I can't take it. All right, that is it for this portion, and I will see you next time.